Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I think we're on the way to getting peace. I think President Putin wants peace, and President Zelensky wants peace, and I want peace. I just want to see people stop getting killed.
On Wednesday this week, US President Donald Trump stunned European leaders and the world, announcing he'd agreed with Russian President Vladimir Putin to start negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. And he's starting to tell leaders of the bloc what they need to do to secure peace. And as the week came to an end, the president also talked about reciprocal tariffs that could cost Europe dear. I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Government and Economics at Bloomberg, and welcome to this special Trumponomics, the Bloomberg podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, how he's already shaped the global economy, and what on earth is going to happen next. So we're recording this bonus episode from the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, which has taken on enormous significance this year, given the recent arrival of Donald Trump back at the White House, all the discussions around the future of Ukraine, and indeed a high-level US delegation coming here, led by J.D. Vance, who's making his first trip to Europe as vice president. And our question this week is, can Europe foot the bill? Can Europe handle the financial burden that comes with the president's plans for ending the war in Ukraine? And on top of that, his potentially hefty demands on trade. With me, we have someone who's been to many, many of these, Alberto Nardelli, Bloomberg's correspondent-at-large for Europe. Alberto, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And I've grabbed you from, I know you spend most of your time in the corridors getting next day's scoop. And Antonio Barroso, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst for Europe for Bloomberg Economics, one of the geoeconomists that we've brought into Bloomberg recently. He previously launched the geopolitical risk unit of the consulting firm Teneo and worked as a senior analyst at Eurasia Group and, for good measure, has a PhD from the LSE. So good to be with you,
Great to be
Antonio.
here.
So whatever the US president decides on for Ukraine, we're pretty clear on one thing, that Europe isn't ready to shoulder a large share of the burden. Bloomberg Economics has calculated that protecting Ukraine and expanding European defence could cost the continent's major powers an additional $3.1 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, Antonio, I know you're the one who came up with some of these numbers, or at least you've been putting them together working with your colleagues. So just talk us through briefly how you get to that $3.1 trillion.
Sure. So we calculated that supporting Ukraine militarily for the next 10 years will amount to around $175 billion. Then the second important figure is $130 billion, which is the gap that we estimate between the estimated cost of reconstruction for Ukraine and the available sources of funding that have been lined up. And then $2.7 trillion, which is the amount of debt that the 5 largest European NATO member states will incur if they were to increase defense spending to up to around 3.5% of GDP.
And we should say, and that's the 3.5. So the President Trump has said that everyone in NATO should go to 5%. You're not even, this very large number is not even assuming that. It's assuming a much smaller increase.
Sure, because, you've seen a country like Poland that clearly is taking the threat of the Eastern Front of Russia very seriously, and that has rapidly increased the defense spending. But that's very challenging for countries such as Spain or Italy that will start from a very low level, and also that had very large debt and deficit burdens. How are you going to increase spending to that level? Are you going to cut pensions? Are you going to cut education spending? I don't think so. It's very politically complicated to do it. So we assume that 3.5 will be a much more realistic target, so to speak.
Realistic, yeah, in inverted commas, because it still seems like a very large number. Alberto, one of the things that you've heard, and particularly in the last day or so, as everyone was absorbing the news of President Trump's call with Vladimir Putin, The one thing in all of this which people recognise Donald Trump is right about, and I guess Joe Biden was right about, that the period where Europeans could rely on the US to shoulder such a large share of the burden of defending Europe, that is past. Do you get a sense of anyone realistically kind of grasping what follows next? I hear a lot of defence people and military people talking about what's needed. I don't hear so much from the politicians.
I think the mood is one of shock, mostly. If you speak to politicians, not just defense politicians, say in Eastern Europe, they do get a sense of what might be coming down the road. The challenge is mostly in Western Europe, countries like Spain, Italy, but even Germany, and who still see this conflict as something ultimately far away. They want to support Ukraine, but they don't see the potential consequences of it unraveling, hitting their own borders. And if we look at these numbers, they're big numbers. However, at the end of the day, it's a small percentage of their GDP. So really, this is about political will and understanding what is at stake. The security of Ukraine, the security of Europe if Ukraine unravels, and ultimately trying to basically, like you said, with the US pulling back some of its security commitments, does Europe have the will to step in and understanding the consequences of that? I do feel that there is a fundamental difference, say, with Trump's approach to Biden and presidents before him on Europe picking up more of the burden, which is the point of transatlantic allies. Like previous presidents, they have always asked Europe to do more, but they've never put into doubt the pillars of the world order, be it on trade or on security. I think that is a big difference between Trump and most of his predecessors.
We will say a little bit about trade because, not content with giving one very large bill to the Europeans, is that there's talk in some of President Trump's announcements about tariffs. That's obviously could also be very financially costly for Europe. But Antonio, just going back to this question of Europe's position, I mean, what are the options if we're going to be true to Trumponomics in the sense we're going to spend a little bit more time on the economics of this? What are the routes for managing that additional burden, which we're presuming would be through debt? But how could you get there from here?
Sure. So you have several options. The first one is to give European Union member states that are subject to fiscal flexibility to spend on defense. But the problem there, as I mentioned before, is that many of these countries have large deficits. They have been trying to reduce. We have seen how difficult it was to pass a budget in France. And, even if they were trying to reduce the deficit and now they're reducing it to a smaller level.
France that has a 6%.
Exactly, right? It's a tall order for these countries to do that by themselves. So the second option is, let's do it at the EU level. So let's issue joint debt. And we know how fractious the debate has been on that issue in the past. We managed to do it during the pandemic with the Next Generation EU facility. And there are some ideas that have been floated, like, okay, let's do the same, but for defense. I think you cannot take any kind of decision for the moment until you have a new government in Germany. It's interesting, though, that you've seen Nordic countries that tend to be seen as more frugal. They have changed the tone because I think for them, as Alberto was describing, the security threat is much more material than for other countries. So they're changing. Still, the conversations will be very, very difficult. And the third option, at least for Ukraine, will be to use the frozen assets, the $300 billion that have been frozen in assets. But that has also political and technical complications. So there is no easy solution.
And we've seen some discussion around even using those assets now. I think the administration has even potentially talked about using them for arms. So there's plenty of potential uses. And as you say, it's very legally difficult whether you can use them at all. There is a structural issue here which goes to the nature of the European Union, which I guess we should say, particularly those who don't spend all their time thinking about European institutions, God help them. This is an organisation that was set up and has developed around economics, but also as a way of using economics and trade to preserve peace within Europe. It came out of a post-World War II environment. At a sort of deep level, it's not designed as a collective defence organisation to protect Europe from outside. So I'll ask both of you, but do you see any signs, Antonio, of the European Union grappling with that? Or is it going to be more about individual countries deciding to produce different alliances?
So that is indeed the challenge. So when political scientists look at how Europe reacts to crisis, they normally look at two variables. One is whether the competence to deal with a crisis belongs to the European Union, the European Commission, or the member states. And second, whether the shock that the crisis has created is asymmetric or symmetric. That means it affects all member states or individual member states. I think that's why you probably will see a different reaction on trade issues than on defense issues. On trade, the European Commission has the competence. And, at least for now, the tariffs are affecting all countries. So it's way easier to deliver a common response. On defense, though, and exactly to what Alberto was saying, the shock is asymmetric because, for some countries, Ukraine is just too far away. So I think the problem in the defense area is that it's very difficult to come together, especially when the European Commission doesn't have competence to deal with it. So it's member states that need to come together and take a decision. And the problem is that for years, they have been very reluctant to coordinate or to do closer coordination on common foreign and security issues. And I think Europe is now paying the price for that.
And it's even harder because whatever you think about the UK, it is one of the most important defence powers and most experienced foreign policy powers and recognised as such, and is not in the European Union. So you have to come up with a plan for the UK. Alberto, this takes us to just the lack of an individual to negotiate with Donald Trump. I think that's the one thing that sort of people have been very struck by over the last, a few weeks, but certainly the last 48 hours, is Donald Trump's absolute insistence on talking and negotiating one-on-one with people who he considers to be his peers. And the European Union just doesn't have anyone like that. And what do you hear from people at the conference so far about what the answer to that's going to be?
I would argue Europe doesn't have someone like that, let alone the European Union. To latch on to what Antonio was saying, because I think it's very relevant, is there are institutional issues that the European Union has in terms of dealing with Trump. The first is that the EU is very good at negotiating within the rules. So in the halls of the WTO, the EU often gets what it wants. It's very good at doing that.
I think it's one reason why Donald Trump doesn't like it.
No. And in this world, like in this jungle where it's, I want this, what will you give me in return for this? The EU is not built to do that. And that is also linked to the specific point of your question, which is who speaks for Europe? Because normally the way the EU negotiate, it will have officials, and you will have conversations between officials, between two different parties, and then eventually it floats to the top on the more political issues. You do not have someone who is able to negotiate in the same type of language, terms, as Donald Trump, and it's not clear who could fill those shoes. Maybe one idea, they could appoint an envoy for, say, Ukraine talks, for example. They've done that with sanctions. It's a lot lower level and the stakes are a lot lower, but that could be an option. But I think there are institutional limits in terms of the way the European Union has set up. And one reason why, when you speak to European officials in the past few days, you have this sense of shock is they haven't fully come to terms with this new reality, that there is no point having a meeting with a US official and saying, oh, this is illegal because of rule, whatever, of the WTO. Trump doesn't care. You have to, the question for Europe is, are you going to deal with this administration and negotiate on his terms, on how reality is, or are you going to hope that the world changes again?
And of course, it's an example. It reflects how much the sheer pace of activity coming out of the White House is testing everyone's bandwidth, that we're running together in this conversation. We're running a whole trade argument and a trade issue and how it relates to Europe alongside a really quite distinct question about the future of Ukraine. And even that is a test for Europe to have to think about two things at the same time. I mean, in the same hour, Donald Trump is posing these enormous threats. But we should try and resist the temptation to run it all together, because the tariffs conversation has a particular implication for Europe and maybe even makes it harder to for Europe to respond in the way that Antonio has suggested. He has talked about these reciprocal tariffs. And what that means, just to be simple about it, is that the US moves away from a situation where there's a very broad-based assessment of tariffs. And by and large, for historical reasons, developing countries have had higher tariffs against the US goods than the US has had against them. And the rule within the WTO, as we know, is if you have one tariff against one country, it's supposed to apply to everybody else. He is overturning that and suggesting that there will be individual tariffs negotiated or individual terms negotiated by country in relation to not just their tariff levels, but also everything else they have. And I think it's the everything else. We had some research from Maëva Cousin, sort of senior trade expert on Bloomberg Economics, who was just pointing up, if he just took tariffs, the impact of this new regime would be particularly bad for developing countries and emerging market economies, not so bad for Europe because their tariffs are relatively low already. But if, as Donald Trump has said quite clearly, he's going to consider VAT, value-added tax, and regulations and other things in that calculation and consider them in trade barriers in the same way, that could potentially be extremely costly for the EU. So then you get into a mode of it would be every country for himself. I mean, do you think there's a possibility that France, I don't know, I'm looking at you, Alberto, Antonio as well, that France will end up doing separate deals with the US? Italy, Giorgia Meloni maybe will think she can get a better deal. Are we in a world where that's conceivable?
I think from the US perspective, that is probably the strategy. I think you may see different tariffs for different countries. From the EU perspective, it's very hard to say. On trades for now, they have remained united and they have stuck to this position of trade as an EU competency. And so far that unity has not buckled. I think if you put it all together, some countries may be tempted. I would say more countries like Hungary rather than Italy, because I think there are other issues like migration, where it's in Italy's strategic interest to be close to the EU. I think one key point is this bigger picture, which makes the threat to Europe kind of unique, like different from, say, emerging countries or even countries like, Japan, for example, which is Europe is facing this at the same time, this economic threat and this security threat. Other countries are able to say, we are going to focus on the security. We want the US to provide security. We're going to give him wins on economics and trade. You take, for example, the UK's approach. The UK has pretty much said nothing almost about the steel tariffs. The EU issued immediately a press statement saying they're illegal, etc., etc. So clearly the UK is thinking security is more important. Let's give him some economic wins.
Although, I mean, you mentioned Japan. Actually, Japan also is sort of skewered on that one because they have their biggest trading partner is China and their biggest source of security is the US. And so that, for them, is an extremely painful conversation. Antonio, did you have any response on this possibility of a country-by-country approach? And how's Europe even going to avoid that, given the way that Donald Trump is dealing with Europe?
Well, I think you're both absolutely right. I think the risk is that the more specific he goes, the higher the risk that Europe will divide itself because of the opportunity of offering specific deals to different countries. But it's one thing that I think we need to keep in mind as well, which is the type of justification used for the tariffs. Because if he starts saying, I'm going to put tariffs on you because I want you to drop your digital service tax, that's coercion. You're not making an argument about the trade deficit. You're making an argument about the fact that I don't like your tax. You need to get rid of it. And the problem is that opens a can of worms because the EU created an anti-coercion instrument during the last European Commission's term, European Parliament term, that allows the EU to impose very strong restrictions on trade and other measures on the US.
So there's a sort of economic nuclear option.
It's a nuclear option. And I think the problem is that if that question poses itself, I'm not sure how many member states will be in favor of doing that, because my impression is that maybe that instrument was created not to be ever used.
So it really is a nuclear option.
It is a nuclear option. So I think it's a question to monitor, because if Trump starts doing things and it's just the first wave, what about Greenland, for example? We hadn't even spoken about Greenland. What if he says, I put tariffs on Denmark because of Greenland. That is a clear case of economic coercion, and that discussion is going to pose itself very soon, probably.
And just a quick follow-up on you, because we did mention the German election. I mean, there could be some who would say, well, it just happens to be very bad timing because we have lack of clarity about the future of Germany at the same time as all of this is coming to a head here in Munich. How does the German election change things in this debate, particularly about Ukraine, I would argue, and the challenge of defence, but the challenge of negotiating on Ukraine? Does it really make a difference, given the sort of choices of government that we're looking at in Germany?
Well, I do believe it makes a difference because what we had up to this point was just not working. Everybody in Brussels and in different national capitals was expecting essentially for some kind of clarity because the coalition here was not working together.
The German coalition.
Yeah. And there was some sort of political paralysis. And that political paralysis in Germany translates into political paralysis in Europe, right? So at least you're going to get some kind of clarity. I think really how fast Germany can get a coalition government in place will provide a signpost of the times to come. If they actually, the parties that have to form a coalition realize that this is a very grave moment and that they need to work together relatively fast, then I think that's a good omen for decision-making in Europe. However, if we crunch the numbers and the forming a coalition in Germany has taken longer and longer in recent elections, if they follow that pattern, I think that will be very worrying for Europe.
And last word to you, Alberto. I don't know. You said you've been to many of these summits, and I guess one theme that's kind of running through this conversation is that one-on-one conversations that Donald Trump has, and indeed just singular statements that Donald Trump makes on his own, have made a much bigger difference to international affairs in the last few days than any amount of talk here in Munich and potentially any kind of high-level summit of government leaders that you could have. It doesn't feel like we're in a multilateral or a multi-country universe when it comes to these kind of negotiations. Does Munich feel like an outdated institution, this kind of conference, in a world where really it's all about who Donald Trump decides to pick up the phone to next?
I wouldn't go that far in the sense that in terms of the US decision-making process, it is very much centered on one individual and that person's relationships with his peers, which increasingly tends to be less and less in Europe, for example. However, how the rest of the world reacts to that, or in particular how Europe reacts to that, lots of those conversations will be happening in places like here. So there is value.
Where they get their ducks in a row, maybe.
Well, right now they're running all over the place. I'm not sure they're going to get them in a row.
All right, well, I guess we will find out. But thank you very much to both of you. And thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Trumponomics from Bloomberg in Munich. It was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and I was joined by Alberto Nardelli and Antonio Barroso. Trumponomics is produced by Samar Sadi and Moses Andam, with help from Chris Martlew and sound design by Blake Maples. Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. To help others find the show and enjoy it, please rate and review it wherever you listen.